Today, we're joined by Dr. John Kohnke, a leading expert in equine nutrition, to tackle a critical question for trainers in the Gulf. How can targeted supplements unlock new levels of racehorse performance in the region's intense heat and humidity? With his deep international experience, Dr. Kohnke will reveal the biggest nutritional gaps, key micronutrition, and also strategies for pushing past the feed ceilings, plus the real ROI on supplementing versus feeding up. Join us today for practical insights to help your horses thrive when conditions are the toughest.
Thanks very much. A pleasure to join you.
Excellent. Great to have you here. So tell me, John, what's the biggest nutritional gap you see in traditional feed programs for racehorses training in the GCC extreme heat?
Well, there's two or three nutritional gaps. The first one is energy. Sometimes they have too much energy. We'll talk about that as well. We'll go into that in a moment. And also too low energy. That's important for finishing ability, particularly in a racehorse. Sometimes the protein content's too high, and that'll make them too hot inside because extra protein in the hindgut ferments to 6 times more heat than fiber and carbohydrates. So that makes them too hot. So it's usually from alfalfa, but although the leaf is often not there. And the other thing is calcium is so important. I mean, a lot of people don't feed enough calcium. You don't feed alfalfa, you've got to add extra calcium to the ration. We can talk about that as well. And then it's sort of stored hay. A lot of the hay coming into the Middle East has actually been stored for some time. Some maybe hay the previous season hay, and people store it and then they send it in, ship it in, and that can be a problem too because storing hay in the hot weather will reduce its vitamin A content within 6 months by 80% and its vitamin E content by 50% over 6 months. So those sort of things, you can't rely on what's in hay. You've got to have it in the feed as well.
Wow. And what would be for you the 3 essential ingredients that must be in any supplement for racehorse training? As we mentioned.
Well, in the feed, I think energy is the most important. Look, I've done thousands of rations for horses over 50 years. I've been a vet for 50 years and interested in equine nutrition.
Wow.
And consulted with studs and racehorse trainers all around the world. And energy is one of the things that people don't realise how important it is. Now, the big problem we have in early training, when a horse comes into work comes from some other country, comes to the Middle East and starts into work, a lot of trainers start on a high grain ration straight away. You can't do that, especially if it's been in a pasture. If it's been in Europe pasture, in England, the UK, or wherever it's been, and it's been on pasture, it's been fed mainly hay during the hot season when the off season's on. Well, then you've got a different type of gut microflora in the hindgut, what we call microbiota. And they lose the ability to digest starch, which is what's mainly in grain, cereal grains. And the problem we see now, and we've seen it for years and years and years, and a lot of people, I didn't know too much about until some research a few years ago sort of actually pinpointed what was going on. And what's actually happening if you have a horse that's used to eating, is on pasture, and the main fibre is cellulose, or the main structural fibre is cellulose, well, the hindgut bacteria over time adapt themselves to digest cellulose. So and other fiber. So then when you come into the racing stable and you suddenly start them on a lot of grain, like 3 or 4 kilos of feed in a bag a day, and it's full of grain carbohydrates, well then you've got a problem, particularly starch, because horses don't have a lot of starch ability to digest starch initially unless they have time to adapt to it. And some of the starch is not very available in the small bowel. If it goes through quickly into the hindgut, it can cause an overload of starch into the hindgut, and the microbacteria, or the microbes in the hindgut, we call them microbiota, can't handle the starch. So therefore they go crazy. And one species called lactobacilli can digest starch very quickly and digest it to a thing called D-lactic acid, which is a very dangerous acid for the hindgut. It lowers the pH of the hindgut, digests it down to less than 6 pH units in some cases. And that causes a lot of problems like nervous conditions. It causes pasty, really soft droppings, smelly acid droppings, excitement, and also injury risk. Horses can't focus properly. It's all in there. It affects your whole system. Also, you get a thing called sore feet syndrome. A study in 1983 by a guy at Linford and Associates in America showed that about 46% of racehorses suffer from what we call sore feet syndrome because of too much grain too early in training. And you get them to get sort of really proppy gait, and they can't walk properly. They're very shuffly. And you can see on their coronary bands, you've got a ring going down below their coronary band. The feet, they're quite sore on the soles. And, you know, people put up with it and got diarrhea and really smelly, sometimes whole grain going out in their droppings. And people see that. And I used to see it at Randwick. I used to go there a lot. And you'd look over the stable door and you can say, oh, this horse has been in 6 weeks, has it? And he said, hey, you know, I can see by the rings on his feet and he's got, you know, really soft droppings and he's got hindgut acidosis. Now, over the years, it's been commercialised a bit too much, I think, but it is a big problem in early training. Not so much once you get the horse adjusted to the starch. And that takes, if you don't do anything, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks of slow introduction of grain, not sudden introduction, but slow introduction of, say, 500 grams every 4 to 5 days of increased your grain ration, and you feed more roughage and you slowly take the roughage down. You should always feed about 50% by weight of roughage in the diet, and it's hay and or some people use chaff and all that sort of things. But basically, to do it slowly, because if you do it suddenly, you get a sudden overload of starch, and that can cause the problem. And you can alleviate the problem by feeding supplements like probiotics. And we have one called Fabi, which a lot of trainers here in Australia use, where they started about a week before. If another horse is coming into work, they start on this prebiotic and probiotic product, which then helps the hindgut bacteria condition themselves and replaces the bad ones with the good bacteria that actually start to produce and digest the food better without the acid. And the type of microbes in Fabi, for instance, are specific to horses, and they actually reduce the acid level of live yeasts and that in there. They actually reduce the acid level in the hindgut, so they don't suffer from the problem. But the biggest problem is when I was in working on racing stables, the young horses that come into work, they're on high grain straight away, and they're absolutely crazy. I mean, they can't be handled, they're spooky, they jump up and down, they can't focus on their training, and it's very dangerous for both the horse and the rider. So many young people got dumped off the horses on the way to the track, you know, they're sort of really excitable and sore feet, they can't run properly, so you really got to look at that really carefully. So I find that, now the other thing I do in training sometimes, and some people feed what they call high grain feeders. They've got to feed a lot of grain, excuse me. And basically what I normally recommend there is they feed a certain amount of grain, say 5 kilos or whatever, enough for the general workout every day. But then just before the race, they increase it by adding another, say, 750 to 1 kilo, 750 grams to 1 kilo of cracked corn, which I find over 30 years has been really good because it just increased the energy level for the last 2 days before the race, and they don't have a risk of tying up or being stupid on it, being silly, if they're adapted to starch. And what happens, they run really well and they finish better. And the thing is that you don't have to live with them all the time. If you've got a really high grain, they're really sort of nervy, some horses, and they're really uptight and they can't focus and don't sort of, concentrate on racing. They're all over the place. And if you do that and just cut the energy back a bit while they're in training, and then when they come towards racing, just increase for 2 or 3 days beforehand, that's the best way to manage it, I've found over a long time. And that really helps a lot. The other thing, of course, is too low energy. On a lot of prepared feeds, they have an energy level. They have so many megajoules per kilo on the bag. And unfortunately, that may not be very accurate. Some of what we call book values are out of a book. They're not actually been analysed. The feed hasn't been analysed. Look at the energy level, what it actually contains per kilo. And sometimes it's lower than what they predict. They always like to have a better label claim than anyone else, I guess, like most people. But the thing is that sometimes that energy level is lower than what they actually use in the feed. And you're thinking of giving enough energy to the horse, but it's losing weight. It's not doing very well. It can't finish up a race. And, that's quite sometimes just increase a little bit extra grain or add a little bit more of the feed, you'll get a better result straight away. Within 2 or 3 days, they start to improve. So that's 2 things I find. So I think that's one of the most important things in the Middle East, where you've got a lot of hot climates, you need energy, and they just lose so much energy just working and that all the time. And sweating doesn't cause a lot of energy loss, but it's protein loss and it's everything else, and salt loss, of course. So basically is having enough energy and adapting the energy to the level of training, and when you're racing a little bit more, that helps a lot. The other thing about starch is that if you have too much starch in the feed, and I mean, your should feed 3 to 4 times a day in small amounts of starch, studies have shown it increases the risk of gastric ulcers, and particularly the ones in the lower part of the stomach, what we call glandular ulcers. And that's a problem. And now they recommend you limit the amount of starch to 2 grams per kilo body weight per day, per feed, which leaves about 1.5 to 2 kilos of grain maximum. Oats can be fed, if you're feeding oats as a whole grain, that can be fed about 2.5 kilos per feed. That'd be enough energy, 3 feeds enough energy for the horse. But some of the other grains, especially the high starch, you've got to really limit them. And that helps a lot to reduce the risk of ulcers as well. I mean, there's lots of other reasons for glandular and squamous cell epithelial ulcers, of course, stress and everything else, but that's one cause of it. and working a horse too hard for more than 5.5 days a week, studies have shown that increase the risk of glandular ulcers in the lower part of the stomach. So those sort of things are helpful, but mainly looking at the energy level and just making sure they don't get too much energy too quickly, and that will reduce the risk of overloading starch in the stomach, which also ferments about 25% of the starch, 20 to 25% of the what we call non-structural carbohydrates are fermented in the stomach, and it increases the stomach acidity, which is not what you really want in some cases if you've already got an ulcer there, particularly a squamous cell ulcer in the upper lining. You know what I mean?
I was just wondering, so how do you determine like when a racehorse has hit, his feed ceiling and needs supplementation to break through to that next performance level? How do you find that?
Which for supplementation or just feed?
The feed, like once they reach their feed ceiling, and
Yes.
yeah, when they need the supplementation to kind
Well, I
of
think,
move
a
on
lot
to
of
the
people,
next
they
level.
might have a horse that they've trained to run over, say, 1,200 meters or something like that, and then they suddenly bump it up to 1,400 or 1,600 meters. Well, obviously, it's going to have more energy. So you might have to boost the energy a little bit, because otherwise I find a lot of horses, they run quite well in the first part of the race, particularly sprinters that go like hammers, they can really run fast, but they just run out of energy, not puff so much, not air or anything like that. It's just they run their energy out. They exhaust their energy levels from their muscles. You build up a lactic acid because they're not quite fit enough in some cases, and they just run out of energy. So putting a bit extra energy, I said before the race, 2 or 3 days before, extra 750 to a kilo of cracked corn. I use cracked corn because I find it's really good. It doesn't increase the risk of tying up. I wouldn't feed extra oats because they could have a bit silly on it. Get a bit too excitable because it's very available energy in some of the extruded feeds. So that helps a lot. So what you got to do is bump the energy up. Now, if you're going to increase a horse, he might be running at 1,200 meters, and you suddenly look and think he can do 1,500 or 1,600. Well, then you've got to increase the energy a little bit, and usually go up in stepwise. An extra 500 grams a day for a little while, and just see if that helps, so that's how we normally recommend it, is actually increase the energy relative to the work. Now, the other thing you've got to be careful, of course, if you have energy on a rest day. Now, some people have planned rest days. The horse is going to have Sunday off or Monday off or whatever, and therefore you reduce the energy down in the ration to about a third or so, particularly grain, because otherwise you could have a risk of tying up and getting, tying up problems or set fast, in common terms, and therefore you've got to increase it. But, a lot of people don't realise, and I used to see this a lot, and we still see it, where horses are going quite well, and they get a rest day because it's what we call an enforced rest day. They come bring out the stable in the morning and they're lame, and they can't run them that day, you can't work them, and they keep feeding them out of grain. And next day they're all over the place, they're mad, really too excitable, and they can tie up in some cases, particularly fillies with PSSM type genes. And these horses are really you've got to cut back the grain in the day. You're not going to work it, so you don't increase it until the day, half the next day, and then the full amount the next day after that. So you don't have that sort of sudden energy increase, which can make them really excitable as well. So I think that's an important thing to take into account as well.
Sure. And what do you think would be the ROI timeline that trainers should expect, when investing in a targeted supplement program versus just increasing feed quantity?
Well, I think it takes weeks. I mean, it depends on what you're looking at as a timeline. I mean, people say, oh, I can do this and it's going to be better in a couple of days or a week. I think some supplements, things like vitamin E, for instance, it's important because of the loss of vitamin E in feeds and things like that. And it's not very stable with trace minerals and vitamins and trace minerals in the feed, particularly copper and iron and all that, vitamin E and vitamin A and all those really important vitamins. Horses make some vitamins in their hindgut, but it's not enough for hard work. So you need to add some B complex vitamins. Thing about it is that those sort of adding anything like that, you're not going to get a sudden result. It takes 2 to 3 weeks to get it into the system and make some difference in muscle function and antioxidant function, whatever. We have a product called Muscle Excel, which is a protein booster for horses. It's been around for a long time now, and I've developed myself. It's the first one in the world like it. And basically, it works in about 10 days, but you've got to give it after work within 15 minutes, two scoops a day. You can put in a small double handful of feed so it doesn't get too diluted. Otherwise, it gets lost in the feed and they don't get it quick enough after work. And we can give it as a paste. A lot of trainers in the Middle East actually mix up as a paste in a bit of water in a cup and then they shove it down their throat. Some people make it in bulk and, automatic syringe type thing. The thing is, if you give it after work within 15 minutes, I showed in a study here about 20 odd years ago that you can actually get a result in about 10 days. It'll actually start building muscle in 10 days. And that's faster than most other things. Some people say, oh, yes, they'll build muscle in 3 to 4 weeks or 2 months, well, that's a long time. You've got to do it quickly. And we use that as well before a race and for 2 or 3 days before and 2 days after, so they recover better and things like that. So sometimes the timeline of those things is really increased. And electrolytes are quite fast. It's electrolytes because they're water soluble and they go into the system very quickly. And if you've got a horse that's not drinking, like giving an extra salt will make it drink more in the next couple of days. So it'll probably correct its dehydration a little bit. And if it's a heavy sweater, we have another product called Tropo Salts, which is very popular in the Middle East and certainly Northern Australia. And it's got a special formulation for non-sweaters, that ones that won't sweat very readily. And you get them into hot, and particularly horses that are coming into a hot climate without any preconditioning into the hot climate. So we bring them in the start of the racing season, so they've got time to adjust it, and then they'll accommodate themselves and adjust their hormones and their sort of adrenaline levels, and they'll be a lot happier, and they'll start to sweat properly. But I was in the Middle East 2 weeks ago, as you know, at ADX, and basically a number of trainers said, look, got these horses that come in and they can't sweat for some time, and they get really distressed, start to get the puffs, and they start puffing all the time. They haven't got any, they can't, you can't run them, they get really distressed and blow and puff and thick-windedness from low-grade lack of chloride and potassium in their diet because of heavy sweat. But some don't sweat at all, they can't sweat, they get a sudden change and they can't sweat. And with something like Tropo Salt, which is developed specifically for that, for endurance horses and gallop flat racing horses, it does help a lot because it's got arginine and other things in it, and vitamin C and vitamin E, which also we've found helps the sweat. And within about 5 to 7 days, it starts sweating again, and quite well. And we've had a lot of good results with that. So some things are fast, but generally just fiddling with a diet. Quite often I find it's just a minor adjustment in diet will help a horse run better and run to the line better and recover faster. And sometimes it doesn't need a lot, but just increasing the energy a little bit before the race, maybe the protein I said before, the high quality protein, that helps. A lot of people feed too much protein because it's got good leaf on it and all that sort of thing. You can control it, but a lot of the countries overseas, the growing season for alfalfa in countries like Canada and America can be interrupted by weather, and they quite often instead of drying it in the sun, what we call UV drying or just sun curing, they put it in big heating chambers and artificially dry it, and that doesn't give it any vitamin D. Sorry, it damages the vitamin E and the vitamin A because of the heat, the extra heat. The dryers are hotter than the sun, and that can be a big problem in some horses as well. And the problem is that people sometimes feed too much of it, and too much protein dumped in the hindgut because they can't digest it all in the small bowel causes too much heat fermentation waste in the hindgut, and that can make a horse really sweat more, and in the hot weather particularly, and that can be a problem with dehydration and that in the longer term as well.
So it's important to have the right amount and be careful, I guess, with that, of course.
Yeah, when I do ration analysis, there's a program we use called FeedXL, which is available worldwide. It's a really good, up-to-date program. It's being updated all the time. It's a ration analysis program. It's online, www.feedxl.com. I think you can get it in the Middle East. It has all the different feeds in for different countries, and you can go and put your rations in there and calculate it. And it's very accurate. It's been all modified, so it's really quite easy to use. But I find it very accurate, and quite often I find the protein levels are 160, 170%. That's just too high. You're wasting protein. You've got to get back to about 145. Energy. Quite often I find a ration from a horse that's going to got sort of 85% of the energy needs it needs for its time of stage of training. So you've got to update a bit, and you'll find straight away within a few days of doing that modification, particularly energy, the horse is a lot better. Protein takes a bit longer. It takes time to build muscle mass and things like that. But basically, energy can be adapted quickly to stop over energy on rest days, or a little bit more energy when you need it for a race, for a longer race or whatever.
Perfect. And now I'd like to compare the difference between, of course, temperate climates and desert conditions. So how do high-intensity training in the GCC region change a racehorse micronutrition needs?
Well, stress, what do you mean in the microbiota and things like the stress of training, did you say?
Sorry?
Did you mean the stress of training affecting the horse's digestion?
The needs for the racehorse micronutrition.
Oh, micronutrition, yes. Okay, I didn't understand. I thought you meant microbiota.
How do they compare
micronutrition? Yes, that's important. Desert? I mean, the problem is that, stored feed, people say, oh, it's been stored and it should be okay. it doesn't lose any energy. No, it doesn't lose energy much, but it loses vital minerals like vitamins, like I said, vitamin E and vitamin D and some of the B group vitamins. But you've sort of, most people add that to the diet anyway because it's important to have 1,000 IU of vitamin E per day, and and some vitamin D, D3, just to make sure. Excess vitamin D. The other things I said before, calcium is important as well. And a study done in Australia back in the early mid 70s by the Victorian racing veterinarian showed that 40% of racehorses in Australia got a low calcium intake, and that causes bone stress and risk weak bones. Now, lucerne, or alfalfa in your case, does provide a lot of calcium, 13 grams or 12.5 grams per kilo of calcium, which is fairly bioavailable, but it's in the leaf, it's not in the stem. So if you've got a really stemmy, rough-looking lucerne without a lot of leaf, you don't get very much. So, it's got to be done. You've got to get good quality feeds like that, and sometimes that's not always available. So micronutrition, the other things that are important, like biotin. Now, biotin is a very important thing for the hooves. And horses make their own biotin in their hindgut during fermentation, but it's not enough in cases of high performance horses, particularly racing horses, to meet their needs. In some cases, particularly if they've got poor quality hooves in the first place, like thin soles are very common in racehorses. They've got inherently genetically got thin soles. They tend to get really sore feet if they race and the thin soles, and some bloodlines have very thin soles, so you've got to increase that by either shoeing them and putting on sole relief shoes and all that sort of thing, or some people put pads under them. But biotin will help increase it if it's enough of it. And we have a product called Reboot Hoof, which my daughter and I developed. Dr. Philippa, she's a biochemist, a PhD in biochemistry. She really studies hard on this sort of aspect of horse nutrition, all aspects actually. And we developed a product which has got calcium for the hardness of the hoof and the bonding lamellar inside, particularly in horses that are under stress. And the hooves don't get damaged so easily. It keeps the hoof full hard and without getting shelly and breaking away easily. And then the biotin's at 45 milligrams, but it's protected biotin in a little separate little pellet, which is protected against oxidation and damage. And it's most important to have biotin protected with a coating over it, which you get from Germany, because otherwise, if it comes in contact with free minerals, like we call inorganic minerals that are not bioplexed or chelated, it can be damaged quite quickly, particularly in a feed, sitting in a feed. Now, you might know people in the Middle East import feed from the UK and everywhere else. It takes time to get there, and therefore sometimes it starts deteriorating after about a month, deteriorating down, and you can lose some in the feed. So eating it in supplements that stabilise, it'll be a lot better for the horse's hooves, and you get a response within about 6 weeks. It takes time, but you do get a response. We've seen that. The same as joint supplements. People say, "Oh, I'm going to give a joint supplement today for a horse that's getting a bit sore in the joints," or he's an older horse and you've been running him and he's getting a bit sort of scratchy. And that's the term everyone uses in the joints. And basically it takes time to do it. You can't if you inject it with cortisone, well, obviously you're going to get a response straight away, but that doesn't do anything in the long term for a joint. It starts deteriorating in some cases. And people out of joint say, "Oh, I've got a result within a week." It takes weeks, 2 to 3 weeks at least, and sometimes longer. And then again, the joint supplements we formulated to provide a range of nutrients to actually get the best benefit. Not seeing things like chondroitin doesn't get absorbed well in the horse. We found that in a study in Dubai years ago. And basically, you've got to give something that gets into the joint and micro molecules that are small enough for the horse to digest in the small bowel and uptake. Whereas the long molecules, they can't do it. They don't have the enzymes or the facility to break the big molecules down. And one is metformin, and in humans, which it doesn't work in horses, although people say it does. And certainly chondroitin is too long a molecule. Only 8% get absorbed. So you've got to give the pre-factors or the cofactors to make the chondroitin inside the body in the feed, in the supplement, to actually uptake and make its own inside the body. So that's what happens there.
Excellent. And just the last question, John. So a little bit more of a personal question. What do you think is the biggest mistake you see trainers making when they first start incorporating, targeted supplements into their programs?
I think that they probably add too many at once. They tend to sort of say, "I'll put everything in," and that can be something. And People they double up a lot. It might be in the feed. If you've got a prepared feed, it's probably got a lot of things in it, including salt. And all prepared feeds normally have 1% salt. Now, salt's very important, heavy sweating horses, but people then add a massive lot of salt as well, and half a handful. That's just too much. It's going to make them, pass it out in the urine and pass everything out, including all the vitamins they give the horse. B12 is one thing you've got to be very careful of. A lot of people, when I know they use injections of vitamin B12, to help the blood count and all that sort of thing. But B12, if you give too much of it, studies have shown that actually if you give, say, more than 10 mils of folic B12 or B12 particularly, it'll actually eliminate all the B12 in the body stores because it can't, it senses it's too high, so it starts eliminating out through the urine. So you actually get less, you lose more B12 in the urine than you do by the injection you've given the day before. So you've got to be careful about overdoing it. So those sort of things will be known about. But most, I don't know most people, but I think that people sometimes they add everything to them. I think it's in the feed, and I'll add this as well, and I'll add that, and somebody comes and says, "Oh, this is better." And I've had supplements, some people using 4 of the same type of supplements. Some trainers say, "Oh, use that, mate, it'll make a horse win." And sometimes it's just too much. I mean, they just weird out and pass it out in the urine, and it's costly, and it doesn't do much anyway. And some people probably. The most important one is protein. As I said before, it's important to have some protein in the diet, and good quality protein. It's no good. Things like fava beans, 23-25% protein, good for the probiotics in the hindgut because they have a lot of prebiotic fibers in fava beans and that. But things like soybean meal and canola meal and those sort of things are much higher course of protein, percentage of protein that are available. And so adding a cheap source of protein really doesn't do a lot because amino acid balance is not balanced amino acids and it's not very available. So, it costs money and you're adding something you don't need to add. So, getting a good quality supplements, something that's more wide range, and then adding extra to do it. So we have one called Cell Ultimate, which has got everything in it. It's got 5 different things. It's got the biotin pellet for the hooves and the calcium and trace minerals and vitamins, everything else in 7 different pellets, which are all stabilized. So that lasts a long time. Stability is really good over a number of years, 2 to 3 years. But the thing is that, if you add extra to that one, you're going to add a lot more things that the horse will just not uptake or urinate out, and you're wasting your money. So I think you just got to be logical. As the horse goes up and work, you might have to add a little bit extra vitamin E, a little bit extra B group vitamins. Some people add extra iron. Some class of people say don't add iron to racehorse ration. I tell you, they don't run after 3 weeks. They need iron because they lose red cells, damaged red cells. They produce so many billions a day, but they lose them as well from damage from heat and just friction on the red cells running through the blood vessels at high speed. So there's a loss of those. So you've got to have had some iron, and that iron's recycled to some extent, but not all of it. So basically adding extra iron twice a week, for instance, in the diet, supplement is I think quite well worth it. Otherwise, they will train off a little bit and not be able to run to the line. Okay.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
No worries, please.